Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Starsky Wilson. Dr. Wilson is a pastor, a philanthropist, and an activist pursuing God's vision of community marked by justice, peace, and love. When I first met him, he was president of the Deaconess Foundation in St. Louis, where, among other things, he co-chaired the Ferguson Commission that made policy recommendations following the police shooting death of Michael Brown Jr. And now he's at Children's Defense Fund. He is also board chair for the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy and vice chair of the Forum for Theological Exploration. So he's a funder and a person who's worked in the community, and now also running the Children's Defense Fund. He has this vast range of experience, and we're just really pleased that he could join us today. And so now I will pass the mic to you, Starsky.
Thank you so much, Faith. Thank you, Sarah, both for the invitation and opportunity to be with you in this really interesting, if not unique or tumultuous moment in our history, but also a time of transformation and change for all of us. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here on this call, to be reunited with funding partners, friends in the sector from which I've been dreamfully and forcibly dislodged into the work close to children and families with the Children's Defense Fund. I'm also grateful and share appreciation for past partnership between Urban and CDF, even most recently on work around ending child poverty, on a joint report on policies that could cut child poverty in half in our lifetime. And so it's critical that we work in these institutions, policy and power building, policy and advocacy together, research and advocacy together, so that we might move forward a vision that is best for our children and our youth. I come to this work more than anything else, in addition to the things that you have heard in the bio, as a father. And I'd like to begin some reflection on this theme about the future we deserve by telling you a little bit about my favorite 5-year-old who just barely made her way into this generation Z of which we speak. I'll do this because she also is on the precipice of another group that people have begun to write about, some calling them early on Generation C, the coronavirus generation, or one of my favorites, the baby Zoomers, who are now coming forth. Amber Ella Marie Wilson is a delightful 5-year-old who was born in August in the midst of an uprising. She is a movement baby. In 2014, in the midst of the Ferguson uprising, the first national mobilization of the movement for Black Lives, where young people held the streets and occupied space in response to calls for racial justice and trying to give face and call for accountability around police killings in America, which, by the way, have not stopped since that time, nor have they slowed down in the context of a pandemic that should have called us all to shelter in place. When those young people were gathering outside, drawn to and compelled by the vision of an 18-year-old boy lying in a pool of his own life force, I knew that I had to do something. The reason why I was a funder at the time became clear. It was not to process or to develop logic models and theories of change. It was not in order to get the best seats at the table for community and civic discussions. It was rather to respond to a moment when the community and its leadership would be arrested and not know what to do, while young people were calling them forth to do something and putting their bodies on the line. In the midst of that protracted uprising of over a year, what some have documented as the longest campaign for racial justice, consistent campaign since the Montgomery bus boycott, I was called to the streets and brought my foundation with me, called to the streets and brought the church I served with me, called to the streets in the morning and at night. And part of what I was missing was time at home. But in the time that was home, I was closely holding to the three boys that my wife and I had in the household, reacting to what one of them called the place where their stomach begins to hurt every time they hear about Michael Brown. You know, the toxic stress, you know, the trauma of the moment of racialized uprising and injustice, the trauma of wondering if it will be you. And in the midst of the stress and strain of that extended campaign of over 18 months, 2 years, when I add the work on the Ferguson Commission report, that time when people like Faith have heard me say, my suits got a little tighter from the stress and the gained weight. My hair got a little grayer, so I began to cut it lower. As we wrestled with all of that and the negative impacts of trying to pour oneself into that work, yet got clarity about the call of philanthropy in my own life to react and respond to the moment, I also was blessed with a great joy. And that was the entry into the world, the birth into the world of Amber Ella Marie Wilson, who now finds herself 5 years old, entering magnet public school pre-K 4 courses virtually. Can you imagine going to pre-K virtually? This is what Amber Ella Marie is experiencing. She, who is launching into the world and public life at this point that is COVID-19 pandemic, at this point that is American uprising, another expression of uprising. In Minneapolis this summer, as she was preparing to go to school, images like the one over my shoulder where young people began to don masks and gather around images of George Floyd to say that they have something to say in this moment, yet having to protect themselves with masks. This is the moment in which Amber Ella Marie began to launch into public life in her classroom. And her experience is what compels me to discern what I might do in this moment. What is my responsibility as a child advocate, one who works in the context of philanthropy, and maybe some of the discernment that you're working through as well? What is the future we deserve? I wrote a reflection last week saying what I know about Amber Ella Marie is that her eyes are on me. What I said publicly to the world was, our children are watching. And in the context of this theme, I want to say that the only future we deserve is the one we are willing to work for, fight for, and invest in right now. The only future. In many ways, I do not believe the America that expressed itself last week through insurrection and anti-democratic action at the Capitol, just up the street from where I currently sit, does not deserve Amber Ella Marie Wilson. This America does not deserve the multiracial community of young people that now exists. 74 million young people in America under the age of 18, 30 million more under the age of 25, more than 105 million gathered together, and the most diverse generation in American history. As of 2020, the majority of children in America under the age of 18 are children of color. I have said this before. This means that any work around child well-being, including the work that we do at the Children's Defense Fund, operates at the intersection of child well-being and racial justice. One cannot speak of the well-being of children in America going forward without speaking of racial equity, without speaking of inclusion and cultural competency, and be taken seriously. The children of America are children of color, even to the point where it may not be necessary to speak of color when we speak of children. They are indeed one of the same. racial justice work is child well-being work, and child well-being work must be racial justice work. And this has implications for how we discern our call as advocates, as organizers, as investors in the well-being of the nation and our children. These 105 million, the largest generation in the American population today, also reflect the challenges of these moments. I noted before, people call them different things. As soon as May, 2 months into our mobilization of the pandemic, USA Today was wondering, what would we call this coming generation? Even jumping past Z, in May of that year, the New York Times began to assess data from policy centers talking about the impact of coronavirus, calling this group the coronavirus generation, being thoughtful about the impacts generation to generation of significant events that mark the distinctions between them. There are those who say that Generation Z is marked in many ways, and this transition between millennials and the like becomes marked by 9/11. The realities of the September 11th bombing, that there are ways in which the movement for Black Lives and the coronavirus moment will mark this generational shift. Of course, it is too early to tell. But what we can say is that we know that some of the things that are happening around them will have lingering effects that we must begin to react and respond to. I will lift a couple of them before I want to offer and suggest how I think we should respond. Some of the things we should be thoughtful about, of course, have to do with this critical shift that we have discussed in demographics, and the majority of them being children of color. We also have to be mindful and never forget that because they are diverse, much of this has to do with the growth in brown population, and specifically Hispanic populations, and be thoughtful about the impact of the last 4 years of immigration policy and the environment of white nationalism that has caused a chilling effect, where even foreign-born citizens and those who are immigrants in our country have access to certain policy solutions and supports, access to things like healthcare, but do not engage them for fear of the government, of governmental retribution. CDF's office in Texas has been doing some work around this, seeing it happen from particularly Mexican citizens in the state of Texas. And as we go forward, we should be mindful of the chilling impact of white nationalism on children and access to policy supports today. We should be mindful of the trauma of this moment, recognizing that sending children home to shelter in the context of the pandemic has not been valuable and helpful for all, but rather exposed many to additional tension and stress in parents that causes for them increased exposure to trauma and domestic violence. We must be mindful that 2.5 million more youth live in poverty now than did in the spring when we began to shelter in place, and the note that we still have work to do around COVID reforms and relief that allows the extension of the eviction moratoriums. We must be mindful of the structural changes and shifts in social norms happening around this group of young people, from shifts in the future of work. Will it be physical? How much will be physical? How much will be virtual? The precarious nature of the gig economy that was growing prior to the pandemic and its lack of social supports. And finally, online learning and the impacts it will have on the processes of credentialing and accreditation for institutions going forward in a new environment. What would it mean to get a job based on what credentials? Recognizing that this creates a unique ambiguity for these children, I want to suggest that philanthropy has to do at least 3 things, and I'll be done. Number one, I want to offer, in the voice and in the spirit of this week, where some of us will focus our energies on reflection on the legacy of Martin King, is that in his work, Why We Can't Wait, he raises the question and the challenge and calls for America to make a call that I'll make right now, to resist gradualism I want to offer that in this moment of such crisis and transition, what we need is not a moment to try to go along and get along. We will hear cries. We have already begun to hear cries and appeals to keep things, to make things normal again. Normal was not working for people of color. It will not work for this coming generation that is majority people of color. Philanthropy must resist gradualism and see in this moment an opportunity to swing for the fences. This is a moment for what others have noted as New Deal era thinking about public policy and shifts in reflections on the social contract. This is the moment where we should have the boldness to invest permanently in child allowances, like the other developed nations and our English-speaking counterparts in England, in Canada, and in Australia. We should pay attention to the fact that in 2020, we actually had a majority of legislators in the Congress to sign on for this, at least in the Democratic caucus. It made it into early dialogue about COVID relief in the HEROES Act. So we've got to release gradualism and swing for the fences for New Deal era reforms. We must increase investment in acceleration of learning, knowledge management, and emergent strategies in our social sector. We must see more partnership between social sector service providers and advocates and institutions like urban and community engaged research in institutions that invest in such. Why? Because if nothing else, my onboarding and learning in these first 90 days at CDF had told me how quickly data gets outdated and how slowly we integrate it into our work. So if everything we're waiting for is evidence-based rather than emergent with opportunity, then maybe philanthropy is not investing in ways that would help it get to the solutions of the moment. We've got a report that's got to come out next month, and we know that it's going to be outdated when we produce it because of the shifts in COVID-19. The last thing, because I've gotten to my time, is that after we resist gradualism and after we invest in knowledge management and emergent strategies informed by partnerships between service providers and researchers, we've got to also invest in supporting multi-generational movement building amongst people of color-led institutions and communities. The reality is this, the model that we have invested in the past in philanthropy has gotten us to where we have gotten today. We cannot resist as the investors, as the social capital, as the investment capital for social change in America. We cannot take credit as a sector for all of the powerful and positive things that are happening in our communities and not own that some of the social infrastructure that we've built has also manifest the trauma that Amber is dealing with because she was watching last week when that insurrectionist attempt happened on the Capitol. And so in a corrective attempt, we've got to invest in movement building among Black-led BIPOC communities in order to respond and resist to our history of investing so deeply in institutions that are driven, dominated by white dominant culture, if not white supremacist means in the first place, in order that we might get to the future that we want, the future that we have earned, a future that is healthy for Amber Ella Marie Wilson, where children who are marginalized flourish, where leaders prioritize their well-being, and communities have the power to assure that they thrive. This is what we're working for at CDF. I know this is the heart of Faith and Sarah at Urban, and we look forward to partnering with all of you to make this happen. Blessings.